What if I told you that one of the weirdest science fiction novels ever written is actually a user manual for surviving right now? I'm going to argue that this acid trip of a novel from 1968 isn't dystopian fiction at all. It's survival instructions for a new age, the one we're living in right now. And sure, it's about androids and empathy tests and electric sheep and all of that, but the author wasn't really writing about robots. He was writing about us, about what happens when performing our lives becomes so sophisticated that we forget there's supposed to be something underneath it all. About what happens when we can't tell the difference between authentic feeling and perfect simulation anymore. It's Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And yes, it is the book that became Blade Runner. But if you think you know the story from the movie, you're in for a surprise. Because Blade Runner was a movie about whether androids deserve rights. But Philip K. Dick's novel asks something much, much harder. It asks that in a world where anything can be faked, how do we stay human? Now sure, both are about androids and bounty hunters and a collapsing Earth, but they have fundamentally different philosophies underneath, perhaps even opposing philosophies. Because Blade Runner gives us this concrete world where replicants fight for recognition within existing systems. But Dick's novel questions what reality is itself, and it asks, how do we survive in an artificial world full of mirrors? And unlike Blade Runner, where there's at least a corporate pyramid with someone in charge, in Philip K. Dick's world, no one's in control. Conspiracies could emerge from anywhere, and they seem to run almost by themselves. And here's where, for me, it gets a bit philosophically uncomfortable, because Philip K. Dick wrote this book in 1968, and yet somehow I feel like he predicted the strange reality we're living in right now. Because he asks, what happens when the artificial and the authentic become impossible to distinguish? And what makes someone genuinely human rather than just a really convincing copy? And if every human response can be perfectly trained and mimicked, how do we know we're not becoming machines ourselves? That's the kind of dilemma that the main character faces in this book, Rick Deckard, and that he confronts every day, even questioning whether he too might be an android. And I think a lot of us might be asking that question of ourselves these days, because we're starting to live in a system that's driven by bots and by AI and by inauthenticity. And whether we like it or not, we sometimes end up shaping ourselves to fit into that inauthentic space. You could call it our own Voight-Kampff moment, except instead of testing for empathy, we're asking things like whether ChatGPT's concern for our well-being is real, or whether our online friendships count as friendship, or whether AI-generated art deserves the same kind of recognition as actual human creativity. Philip K. Dick understood something that I think the rest of us are just catching up to, which is that the most dangerous moment isn't when the machines become indistinguishable from humans, it's when humans become indistinguishable from machines. So today we're going to explore 4 ways this crazy 1968 novel kind of turned out to be a roadmap for right now. We'll look at, firstly, how we're already living in Dick's unstable reality. Secondly, why we're trapped in an empathy arms race with our own technology. Thirdly, how his characters predicted the types of people our system might be creating. And fourthly, why we might all start practicing the artificial religion that he invented in the book. And that last one for me is by far the craziest and maybe the most plausible. By the end of the video, hopefully you'll see why this bizarre, paranoid book might be a really important guide that we have for staying human when everything around us, including ourselves, can be perfectly simulated. So let's dive into Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And welcome back to Philosophical Book Club. So if you've never read a Philip K. Dick novel or story before, well, then you're in for a treat, because Philip K. Dick's world building in the book and everywhere is gloriously unhinged. So let's start with the plot of the book and its key philosophical elements, as well as a spoiler alert if obviously you haven't read the book, which you really should, because it's fantastic. But first, the plot. So after a nuclear war, the Earth is basically dying. and most animals are extinct. The wealthy have fled to off-world colonies, maybe, we don't know, leaving behind the sick, the poor, and exhausted administrators, and then bounty hunters like Rick Deckard. When 6 advanced Nexus 6 androids escape off-world and come back to Earth, very similar to the film, Rick Deckard gets the job of hunting them down. And it's a job that pays well enough to buy what he desperately wants, which is a real animal to replace the electric sheep on his roof. What? You're saying, yeah, well, that's right. Because in this world, owning a living creature isn't just status, it's the primary way to display your moral worth and your social standing. Meanwhile, Deckard's wife, Iran, she's had enough of this life. She's utterly checked out, and she barely has the energy to fight with Deckard in the morning. Instead, she starts each morning programming her emotions on a Penfield mood organ, and she joins millions of people in fusing daily, almost holographically, with this figure called Wilbur Mercer through something called an empathy box, which is kind of like sharing a communal religious experience of struggle and pain with millions of other humans at the same time. So while this is happening, Deckard does his job. He tracks down the escaped androids, and each encounter tests his certainty about what separates the human from the artificial. His work depends on, classically, the Voigtkampf test, which measures empathy to distinguish those humans from those androids. And Dick insists that the test works because the androids in his book, they just simply lack the capacity for genuine empathetic feeling. Deckard encounters Luba Luft, an android opera singer whose love of art and sophistication almost convince him that she's human, until the test finds a great void where her compassion should be. Then there's Rachel Rosen, another android he meets of the Rosen Corporation. And she's an android so advanced that she can seduce Deckard, she can read him psychologically, and she can later extract cold revenge by pushing his newly purchased goat off a building, which is a devastating moment, trust me. I mean, I love goats. They're the best animal. Running in parallel to this hunt is a secondary character called John Isidore. He's a cognitively impaired special human whose instinctive kindness towards the androids hiding in his building only makes their casual cruelty towards him more and more visible. When they find a spider, for example, and they systematically cut off its legs to see how many it needs to keep moving, Isidore's horror reveals exactly what separates humans from even the most sophisticated imitators. It's empathy and it's compassion. In parallel to this horrifying realization, Deckard gets arrested by what appears to be a legitimate policeman and legitimate police station, except it turns out it's staffed entirely by androids, and suddenly he can't tell which institutions are real and which are elaborate performances. His entire reality is suddenly rendered fake, and he has to escape, barely, with his life. And there's another bounty hunter there that helps him escape, but that bounty hunter seems to enjoy his work far too much, even though he is human. By the climax of the book, the foundations of everything start crumbling, but not in the way you'd expect. After Deckard retires the last of the androids, reaching a point of complete moral exhaustion, a media personality named Buster Friendly drops a massive bombshell on live television. Mercerism, it turns out, the religion that almost every human follows in this fallen world, is a complete fraud, just like Stanley Kubrick's moon landings. It turns out that Wilbur Mercer is just an actor. The Hill is a soundstage. The whole religious experience that almost every human being participates in, it's manufactured. The revelation should shatter the practice that holds millions of isolated people together, or at least that's what Buster Friendly and his clique thinks, and it's heavily implied that Buster Friendly and co are actually fake, that they might be androids who never tire too. But somehow it changes nothing. The people keep fusing because the ritual creates real solidarity regardless of whether its source is authentic. Meanwhile, Deckard wanders into the desert and experiences what seems like a genuine vision of Mercer at his side, returning with what he believes is a miraculous find, a living toad, the first one anybody has seen in decades. When Iran discovers the control panel hidden under its skin, revealing that it's just another electric animal, they make a choice that defines the entire novel. They decide to care for it anyway. And the book ends there, with a marriage repaired not by truth restored, but by the decision to maintain attention and empathy even when the object of care is artificial. in a world where the practice of caring becomes more important than the authenticity of what they're caring for. So, what does it all mean? Well, I'm damned if I know. Oh, but I do have to answer that question because this is my video, you say? Fair enough. So we're going to trace how Philip K. Dick's 1968 fever dream became our current reality through 4 of his most startling ideas in the book. Firstly, that we might be living in a manufactured world of shifting realities, just like Rick Deckard. And secondly, what his idea of empathy is, and why it might be the key to being human, and why we might be losing it. Thirdly, we'll look at the attitudes and actions of Dick's characters and what they tell us about the kind of modes of being that these characters have in the world. And finally, why we are not only already living in the kind of world that Dick describes, but why we might be already practicing Mercerism too. And those 4 elements converge on variations of the question I think we're all struggling with now, which is, in a world where everything can be simulated, where do the authentic and the artificial become indistinguishable? And how do we hold on to what makes us human in that kind of world? And how do we keep developing our capacity for genuine connection rather than just settling for increasingly sophisticated simulations of it? But before we get into all of that, let's talk a little about Philip K. Dick's biography and what he was troubled by and going through in the years leading up to 1968 when he sat down to write this absolute acid trip of a book. Because I think it will help us understand what he was driving at, the philosophical questions I've highlighted that arise from the book, and also help us determine whether he was prophetic about what we experience today or just plain crazy. Because Philip K. Dick published Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep in 1968, near the middle of a writing career that would see him produce 44 novels and over 100 short stories before his death in 1982 at the age of 53. He was born in Chicago in 1928, and he spent most of his life basically in California, working odd jobs while writing prolifically for pulp science fiction magazines. And I mean prolifically, like thousands of words a day. I write a lot of scripts for this channel, and I've always been able to write fast and enjoy it, but Dick went far beyond what any normal person could produce. Some of his biographers thought that he might actually have a form of hypergraphia, which is characterized by an overwhelming compulsion to write. But he was never diagnosed with this. And another explanation might just be his prolific use of amphetamines in the period. It's one of those great unanswered questions. But Dick struggled with poverty, he struggled with failed marriages, and he struggled with drug addiction throughout much of his career. Experiences that kind of fed directly into his fiction's obsession with breakdown, with paranoia, and with unstable realities. And by the late 1960s, he had established himself as a major voice in science fiction, though actual mainstream literary recognition beyond the genre only really arrived for him posthumously. His work, I think you might be aware of. You might be familiar with it because it's been adapted into numerous films that I think we all know and love, including Blade Runner, Total Recall, Minority Report, A Scanner Darkly, making him, I think it's pretty easy to say, one of the most influential science fiction writers of the 20th century. Dick's philosophical preoccupations were shaped by his voracious but pretty unsystematic and erratic reading in topics like theology or mysticism or European philosophy. He was particularly drawn to questions about the nature of reality and authentic human experiences, themes that intensified for him after a series of mystical experiences in 1974 that he spent his remaining years trying to interpret, which is a whole nother crazy story we can't get into here, Valis, but it's really fascinating. So a lot of his struggles and his preoccupations leading up to 1968 made it into the text and the philosophy that underpins Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So quickly, what else was going on in the broader world to produce this crazy book? Well, the years leading up to 1968 were particularly volatile, both for Dick and for the world watching itself fracture on television. Dick himself was newly married for the 4th time, and he was helping raise an infant daughter. But he was also broke. The kind of broke where a royalty check for 40 cents might be the only food money that you have that week, which is a true story, and he cashed it just to survive. He published 19 novels, 19 in 1960 alone, but science fiction didn't really pay that well. Do Androids Dream wasn't really born from serenity. It came from a man who was living on the edge, who was strung out and who was typing fast in a world that felt like it was disintegrating around him in real time. There were assassinations, riots, the Tet Offensive, Nixon's election. Dick wasn't a protester, but he signed pledges refusing to pay taxes in opposition to the war in Vietnam, and he was spiritually devastated by the scale of cruelty he saw both in current events and in his research. Part of what actually fed this novel was Dick's horror reading Nazi war diaries, which he was doing for The Man in the High Castle. He found an account of a Gestapo officer who couldn't sleep, not from guilt, but because the cries of the starving children near him were too loud. That detail, the utter lack of empathy, that stuck in Philip K. Dick's mind, and it became kind of like the book's organising question. What makes someone human, and how do we know when that capacity is just completely gone? For Dick, the answer was empathy. And he was worried that modern systems, things like bureaucracies and corporations and wars, were turning people into what he called androids. Not machines, but humans who act like machines. Cold, efficient, and unfeeling. The novel is kind of an exemplification of this fear. The androids look human, but they lack compassion and something fundamental. Meanwhile, some of the humans in the book act just as ruthlessly, and the line between them blurs until the category itself feels pretty unstable. The other influence on the book for Dick was ecological. He just had a moral epiphany learning that the oceans were being poisoned with radioactive waste. He realised that humans were killing the biosphere and that maybe the true test of humanity was whether we could care for other species or not, in his view of the world. That's why the book's society revolves around animals. Owning one is both a status symbol and a moral statement. And the rarer the creature, the more virtuous you appear in the logic of the book. Deckard wants a real sheep, not because it's prestigious, but because it proves that he's still capable of care, that he's still human, even in the inhuman job he has to do. Meanwhile, Dick's philosophical preoccupations kind of grew from his wild and erratic reading. He was really drawn to Schopenhauer's philosophy of compassion as kind of a foundation of ethics. This is the idea that the most authentic morality grows from an automatic, involuntary response to suffering rather than from rational reasoning or principle like in Kant. In Do Androids Dream, this becomes literal because the Voigt-Kampf test doesn't measure whether you can reason your way to moral conclusions, it measures whether something in you flinches when you hear about harm to helpless creatures. The novel's concern with simulacra and with manufactured reality would later resonate with a lot of postmodern theorists, though Dick kind of arrived at these insights through his own combination of philosophical reading and a bit of lived paranoia about authenticity in American consumer culture. And if this novel feels like a fever dream, that's kind of because it is. It's the product of a man who's burned out, who's morally outraged, and who's increasingly uncertain whether the people around him, maybe even himself, can still be counted as fully human. It's not just science fiction, it really is kind of an existential dialogue and a diagnostic, typed up at 3 a.m. under a cloud of amphetamines and dread. Where many science fiction writers of his era focused on technological speculation, Dick used technology as a lens for examining how we can construct and maintain our sense of self and a sense of what's real or what's human, and what practices might hold together all of these categories when everything else is breaking down. And when we ask whether Dick predicted our present, the answer might be this. He didn't need to predict the future. He just described the emotional mechanics of a world that was slowly losing touch with its empathy, that was creating cold systems and strategic performance and simulated care. That mechanism is something that now we are intimately familiar with, and it makes reading him now feel less like visiting the past and more like recognizing a diagnosis we've been living with for decades, but without quite naming it. So what is that diagnosis? Now, if you've seen our recent video on Blade Runner, for example, the question you might be asking is this: what's the difference between the world of the film and the world of the book? And it's worth going into, because in Blade Runner, the reality is solid, it's brutal, and it's unflinching. There's no social media really, or much AI, or really the internet. Like, the themes of Blade Runner are dark and they're relevant, but they haven't really caught the technologies and social interactions of now in quite the same way that Philip K. Dick did. There's just a good old-fashioned corrupt system, exploitation, and life on the streets. A classic noir drama, even though it was then set in the future. When we watch Roy Batty stalking Rick Deckard, we can almost feel the solidity of those punches through the wall or the bodies being slammed against the pavement during Leon's own brutal assault. Deckard gets battered in that film. He gets battered physically, emotionally, and philosophically by these kind of unflinching systems that are there for all to see. They're real, they're physically embodied, nobody can doubt them, everybody's just living with them. That's Ridley Scott's world. It's solid, it's brutal, it's absolutely real. Philip K. Dick's world in the novel works very differently. In it, the characters and us constantly ask ourselves this question of, is it real? When Deckard wakes up, he dials this mood of hopeful determination on his mood organ. He pets his real but fake electric sheep, and maybe he even fuses with a stranger's pain through an empathy box. He lives in an unreal, manufactured world where everything is maybe something else, and all of the experience is mediated through some way or some means or another. Because the difference between the book and the film isn't just aesthetic, but it's kind of fundamentally philosophical, and it goes to the core of how these very different worlds work. In Blade Runner, the social machinery operates pretty much like you'd expect. Corporations own everything, police enforce the hierarchy, economic incentives drive every decision. The replicants there are fighting for recognition with a system of clear but pretty awful rules. But Philip K. Dick asks something more unsettling in quite a different world. He asks, what if the system itself is just another construction that we're all agreeing to maintain, an illusion itself? And what if it's even more disconcerting when the system might crumble before your eyes in real time, and then you have no idea where you are and what's behind that? It's kind of like that feeling when you make it to the other side. I don't know if you've ever had this feeling, but I've had it a few times throughout my career. For example, when I was a university student, I thought that the lecturers knew everything and that they planned out every lesson, every lecture they gave really carefully in advance, that they knew exactly what to teach me at the right moment, and that if I didn't get what they were teaching, I must be kind of missing something. But then I became a university lecturer myself, and I saw the other side. And it was the opposite. It was rickety. It was fly by the seat of your pants. My colleagues and I were just hoping to get through one day to the next under a huge workload and lots of pressure without, being caught out by a tricky question from a really smart student. The lectures were written in a rush, if at all, and we all tried to do our best, but it was all really kind of touch and go. It looked completely different from the other side. The reality kind of fell away for me when I saw it. And I think we've all been through some version of this, seeing the slick polish as the customer when it seems like everything is its own perfect functioning reality, and then seeing the absolute mess on the other side when we're the ones working away and applying our expertise. To me, sometimes the whole world seems to run on this rickety dichotomy, and it's only kind of like the power of illusion, of believing in the surface that's being presented, that actually allows the whole thing to work at all. I think it's kind of that philosophical Wizard of Oz experience that Philip K. Dick is really trying to get at, really in all of his novels. Because the world in Electric Sheep operates on the principle that reality gets held together by chewing gum and sticky tape, really, by habits or by attentions or by the stories we're told or that we tell. And here's the part I think that should make us a little bit uncomfortable. Because in this world, finding out that something is fake doesn't necessarily make it stop working. When Buster Fredley exposes the religion mercerism as stage, people keep fusing anyway. The practice survives because what matters isn't whether the source is authentic, it's that the ritual creates real solidarity between isolated people. And it's moments like this in the book that make us feel like we're not really reading science fiction anymore, but maybe our daily feeds. Because for us, influencers manufacture the authentic moments for something like Instagram. YouTube. Oh, wait, YouTube doesn't have an Instagram clone I'm supposed to plug. Oh well, Instagram then. Because, AI generates images that are indistinguishable from photographs. We can even schedule our moods with medications and apps if we so choose, with sponsors like Headspace. Because let me tell you about... Oh, wait, no, we don't have a sponsor for this video. But we have dating apps that use algorithms to create a reality and simulate romantic compatibility. Corporate social media accounts, for example, that perform empathy during crisis, which, what? Why? I mean, we know they're not a real person, right? But they have to pretend to be, like the androids in the book, in order to kind of like blend in and fool us. And it seems that the underlying question kind of shifts from whether something is real to whether it works. Plus, I think most of us have just gotten exhausted by this, both in our lives and like the characters have in the book. And we've kind of half accepted this and kind of agreed not to notice the absurdity of this shift at all. Because, for example, when did you last know for certain that a photo online wasn't AI generated? When did you last consume something like a podcast or a video that wasn't mediated by an algorithm deciding what you should and shouldn't see? Or better yet, are these genuine moments that don't include these things actually getting further and further apart? Are we swimming in water that more and more is being made up of something else, something simulated? Interestingly, the philosopher Jean Baudrillard mapped this progression. He said that first you copy the reality, then you mask it, then you replace it, and finally you create copies with no original at all. And the San Francisco of the book kind of reached that final stage decades before we did, because the electric sheep of the book isn't a poor substitute. It's often more reliable, more perfectly sheep-like than any biological creature. And what's worrying is that we might be reaching the same point with digital content, where AI-generated art wins photography contests and synthetic voices deliver us our news. And there's another great idea from the book too, straight from Dick's life and from his imagination, called kipple, which is Dick's word for how worlds collapse when nobody's watching, or really when no one is carefully tending to them. It's meant to describe kind of like the drift of useless objects that multiplies in empty or unoccupied spaces. Things like, old catalogues breeding under doors or dust settling like a second carpet. The slow avalanche of junk that just piles up and takes over when we give up. In John Isidore's nearly abandoned building, we watch it happen in real time as empty apartments shed their contents into hallways and neglect becomes visible as actual things. In the novel, it even gives everything kind of a strange, eerie, but abandoned feel. And I don't know about you, but I think the digital equivalent of kipple is happening right now. Because if we check our phones, then how many unread notifications do we have? How many apps have we been meaning to delete? How many things have we subscribed to that we didn't mean to? That's kind of kipple, accumulating in real time. Not this channel, of course, like, hype and subscribe. But Dick saw information kipple coming for decades before we had a name for it. It's that constant accumulation of content that demands attention but really offers nothing in return. Yet your attention, even for a few seconds, is the most valuable thing you have. Now, I know I'm beating a dead horse here. We've heard it from everywhere, but it's amazing how much of this feeling, this kipple, we can find in a book written in 1968. And the rule of kipple applies everywhere. Left alone, Dick's argument seems to be that systems move from order to chaos. Dick's answer is that we don't defeat this kind of entropy. In the book, and I'd argue today, we can't. Instead, we kind of buy time with habits, with the daily unglamorous maintenance work that keeps form intact in a universe that doesn't really care about form. And that's kind of why John Isidore's small kindnesses in the book are so moving, and how they matter beyond just sentimentality. Every time he cleans up or he offers to help, he's pushing back against the fundamental tendency of things to fall apart. And we see that same principle in our own world at the moment, with people who still fact-check stuff before sharing it, or who maintain genuine relationships instead of just collecting followers, or who choose quality attention over the infinite scroll. They are our John Isidores, and as I'll point out in the third section, his character study also offers us an interesting path too. But what about Deckard? Because by the novel's end, his exhaustion reads like a similar version of this kipple, like a kind of moral entropy. He's stopped caring. He stopped maintaining, and you can feel the kipple moving in to claim whatever humanity he had left. It is in some ways a much darker ending than even the final cut of the film Blade Runner. One key point that I think Philip K. Dick makes too well ahead of his time is that the media landscape accelerates this kind of information breakdown. In the book, I mean, although let's see if it applies to us too, because Buster Friendly broadcasts 23 hours a day, filling dead time with gossip and with endless chatter, and where the 24-hour news cycle has become his endless broadcast. Major revelations get the same treatment as celebrity gossip. Scandals that should reshape politics disappear in a constant churn of broadcasting. Truth becomes just another content category, competing for attention against entertainment, and entertainment usually wins because it's designed to be more addictive. That's the background that Philip K. Dick skillfully paints with this minor element in the book. So when Buster finally exposes Mercerism as a fraud, it lands with all the impact of just another weather update, just another segment in this endless feed of talking. And I hate to bring us down again, but doesn't that sound a bit familiar too? Because sometimes it feels like we're living in Buster Friendly's media world now, where exposure of a truth or of something wrong doesn't correct that belief, but just becomes more content that's presented and forgotten. Where the important thing isn't whether something is true, but whether it can generate engagement. And the cultural theorist Marshall McLuhan famously said that the medium is the message. And Dick's book seems to embody this in that minor plot. For example, the empathy box doesn't just transmit Mercer's experience, the technology of shared neural connection fundamentally changes what human community means. It remakes it into something else. And we're experiencing this kind of real-time shift too. It's Twitter arguments that sometimes feel more real and more meaningful than the events they're actually arguing about, or TikTok trends that shape how people experience concerts as they film them for the algorithm instead of actually watching the show. It's like Discord servers that create genuine friendships that exist entirely in text, which isn't something new, but it's really interesting. I think this medium isn't just delivering the message anymore. In some forms, it's becoming the only access to reality that we actually have. And in that atmosphere, both in the book and elsewhere, a certain kind of paranoia becomes quite rational. Deckard gets arrested. He gets taken to a police station that doesn't exist on any map, where the building looks official and the officers speak the right jargon, but it turns out the whole place is run by androids, and this is just Deckard's Tuesday. Now, I know I bring him up a lot on this channel, particularly recently, but Michel Foucault mapped how institutions don't just enforce truth, but actively manufacture what counts as truth in the first place, which seems a little relevant to the systems within which Deckard interacts and which we interact with today. Because a lot of these platforms that we use are machines for manufacturing truth, similar to some of the encounters that Deckard has. They decide what information we see, what counts as legitimate discourse, and what gets amplified or suppressed. And that said, I think the key difference between Dick's fake police station and our current information ecosystem is that we're all walking into the fake station voluntarily every single day. And Dick gives us something more insidious as well. He gives us an ecology of influence where no one's clearly in charge. It's just a constant noisy floor that erodes the idea of consequence itself. And it's a race to the bottom. Because you can't overthrow a talk show. Not really. It's a format and not a thing. And we can't seem to revolt against that saturation itself either. You know, unless we become Amish. But you'd probably think it bites, living in an Amish paradise. In short, as Deckard knows in the book, and I think that we're more frequently discovering, we can't unplug from systems that have become the very infrastructure of our daily lives. So that's the reality that I argue Dick presents, particularly how it contrasts to the world of Blade Runner. But what can we do about it? Dick cuts straight to the bone with a question I think a lot of us are desperately trying to avoid. And that question is, what if empathy can't be taught, can't be programmed, and can't be faked? But we're building a world that assumes that it can be. Because the Voight-Kampff test doesn't measure how much you care about suffering. It measures whether you can't help but respond to it. And I think here's the detail that should terrify us. The test focuses specifically on harm to animals. Why? I think it's because it's harder to fake compassion for a creature that can't argue back, that can't charm you with wit, that can't manipulate you with sophisticated performance. It is, in a way, the one test that cuts through all the noise and can't theoretically be spoofed. Take Luba Luft, for example, in the book. She's everything you want in a person. She's intelligent, she's cultured, she's passionate about art, she's beautiful, she's everything. When Deckard confronts her at the museum, she makes him feel like a thug interrupting something beautiful. For a moment, he doubts his mission entirely. But when the machine measures her involuntary responses, it finds nothing. The test finds a void where the empathy should be, and when they return, the other Blade Runner, Phil Resch, kills her without a second thought. So Dick, I think, sides with Schopenhauer over Kant in one of the oldest philosophical debates about morality. That is ethics grounded in rational duty and thought, or is it grounded in automatic compassion? The Voight-Kampff test doesn't measure whether you can reason your way to moral conclusions. It measures whether something in you flinches when you hear about a butterfly being pinned to a wall. It's looking for the involuntary response, the thing that can't be coached or calculated. Then there's John Isidore, who proves that empathy survives in the most unlikely of places. Officially, he's a special, cognitively impaired, left behind on a dying Earth, and really just written off by the systems that matter. But watch what happens when the androids find a spider and start cutting off its legs, curious to see how many it needs to keep moving. Isidore is horrified. Not because he's thought through the ethics, but because something in him automatically responds to another's pain. And I hate to say it, but we see the same pattern in our own world. We see, or maybe actually we don't see, but completely pass by the people who get filtered out by hiring algorithms, who don't perform well in standardized assessment, or who can't articulate their worth in elevator pitches. Success, our system tells us, is not for them. They're often left behind. But I'd argue that they're often the ones who will stop to help when someone falls, who will notice when their neighbours are struggling, who instinctively care for things but can't offer anything in return, because they're not relentlessly focused on themselves, but on being truly a part of the world in which they live. They're not optimised for some arbitrary race. They're not being measured by a lot of the systems we have in place to measure people in that way. They're the people who stop when they see something wrong. Meanwhile, the people who excel at performing empathy professionally and blowing out all of the scores on all of the scales often score lowest on actual empathy measures. And I think the philosopher David Hume understood what Dick is showing us. Moral judgment starts with sentiment, not reasoning. Those with the highest functioning capacities for reasoning, our Spocks, if you will, have often left this sentiment behind for higher things. And in doing so, they seem to have lost something pretty basic, at least in the way Philip K. Dick sees it. Because often we feel disapproval or sympathy first, then construct our arguments afterwards. And what might get us yelled at for being a bleeding heart or soft or ideological when it might turn out to be the most redeeming feature about us. The androids, for example, they can analyse the situation perfectly but feel nothing. They're like our most sophisticated AI systems. They're intellectually brilliant, but morally blank. They're capable of processing vast amounts of information about human suffering without ever actually experiencing the discomfort that should come with that knowledge. And I think we're again hearing that thought that Philip K. Dick had on reading the diary of that Nazi officer. You know, brilliant people doing horrible things because they're fundamentally cut off from the feelings and the base things that make us most human. Meanwhile, Dick seems to be arguing that our care for animals has become one of our last, most honest tests. After the nuclear war, in Dick's world, owning a living creature becomes the closest thing to virtue that you can put on public display or have. Families study animal catalogues like sacred texts in the book. You know, a sheep makes you respectable, a horse makes you blessed, and an owl would make you practically a saint, something like that. But this is where Deckard's story, I think, really begins. Not with androids, but with shame. Because he tends an electric sheep on the roof and he lies about it every morning. When the neighbours ask him how his sheep is doing, he has to pretend that it's real. That lie is a little bit of a confession. He knows what goodness looks like in the world and he can't afford it. The electric sheep is a daily reminder that he's been priced out of the moral economy of that world. So when Deckard takes the android bounty job, what does he do with his paycheck? He buys a goat. He buys responsibility. He's trying to purchase his way back into a community where caring for something helpless is the only currency that kind of matters. And I think we're all a bit like Rick Deckard now. We're all trying to buy our way back into authentic care through ethical consumption, through charitable giving, through performative activism, anything that might restore our sense of moral standing in a world where genuine empathy feels increasingly impossible to access or to verify, where being a good person truly is kind of becoming impossible. Or as Eleanor Shellstrop put it,
You're not listening.
Holy mother-forking shirtballs.
And I think that's the novel's final move. It reveals Dick's ultimate insight. Deckard finds a toad in the desert, apparently the first living amphibian anyone's ever seen in decades. It's a miracle. It's a sign that life might be returning to Earth. Then Iran discovers the control panel hidden under its skin. The toad is electric, just like everything else. And yet, they decide to care for it anyway, as if it was a miracle. I think this is the choice that we're all facing now too, because it's also a choice and a capacity that we have to hold on to and keep finding space to grow no matter what too. Occasionally, we might be told to go outside and touch grass, but better advice might be to go and plant some grass or even to pat a good boy. I know I reconnect with a part of myself I like every time I get to pat our chairman and CEO, Mr. Elliot. You know, when he lets me. But every character in Dick's novel isn't just a prediction, they're almost archetypes for the kind of society that we're actually building. And chances are you might recognise some of your co-workers and acquaintances in this lineup. So let's start with Rick Deckard, because I think he's us. And that's because this isn't a story about a cop who develops a conscience like Blade Runner is. Instead, in the book, it's about someone whose job slowly destroys his ability to care about anything, including the people he's supposedly working to protect. Each android he retires costs him moral capital he can't quickly replace. And it's not because they're human, it's because for Dick, explicit acts of destruction like this cost us something, even when they are for a good cause. By the time he finally buys that goat, he's desperately trying to patch himself back into a community where caring is the only currency that matters. And does that sound familiar? I've asked it before. You know, how many people do you know whose jobs require them to process humans as data point, as content moderators or HR analytics or social media managers or a dozen different forms as customer service representatives, all slowly having their empathy optimized out of existence? We're all living in some version of Deckard's dilemma now. How many of us work jobs that require us to treat people as problems to solve, or as metrics to optimize, or as engagement to capture? How many customer service interactions or content moderation decisions or hiring algorithms or performance reviews chip away at our capacity to see other people as fully human? The desert walk at the end of the book isn't a redemption arc for me. I think it's a little like a survival protocol. It's a last-ditch attempt by both of those characters to reinstall this capacity for attention and empathy before it disappears entirely. And Deckard embodies our current crisis. He embodies the fact that when the systems we helped to build help people or protect them, end up hollowing out our very ability to actually help them and our capacity to care. And perhaps that's where Rachel Rosen comes in, where she represents where we're heading a little bit, because she can pass every social test. She can seduce any target. She can read human psychology like a manual. But watch what she does with that skill. When she wants revenge, she doesn't attack Deckard physically. She pushes his goat off a building. It's a surgical form of cruelty that targets the practice of empathy itself, not just the person. Her intimacy operates as a kind of instrument, and when advantage requires it, she uses that intimacy, and then it gets switched off like a light. If we look around, I worry that we're kind of mass-producing Rachel Rosens right now. You know, social media influencers who perform vulnerability for profit, or politicians who focus group their empathy, or corporate brands that express solidarity during crises while effectively making those crises worse. It's the very definition of virtue signaling that everybody complains about, but it's now happening so much by these fake entities everywhere that everyone's getting accused of it. And the corrosive part is that the performance of that virtue then bleeds into an automatic accusation against people that are actually virtuous. And the sophistication of this emotional manipulation that we encounter today has reached levels that I think would make Philip K. Dick's androids jealous. And the scariest part isn't that these people, these influencers, are inhuman. It's just that they're becoming kind of the new normal for what human is and what human interaction looks like. We're being told that everybody's an entrepreneur and everybody's a brand now. Everybody is selling themselves. Everybody is turning themselves into that influencer. Or at least interaction with human-built entities like corporations that themselves want to collect the rights of humans without any of the commensurate responsibilities, they're doing this kind of grift too. And then there's the Batty group. You know, there's Roy, Ermengarde and Pris. They're what happens when intelligence becomes completely untethered from empathy. They're everything our education system or our social systems are maybe accidentally trying to produce. They're smart, they're coordinated, they're capable of improvising under pressure and performing perfectly socially. But watch them with that spider. Watch how they treat John Isidore's hospitality. When a living thing is at stake, the empathy dial doesn't move at all. I worry that this is the logical endpoint of our own current trajectory and cultural logic. Maybe we're building systems that optimize for intelligence and efficiency and performance, while treating empathy as kind of like a nice to have but not terribly important soft skill. Maybe we're creating environments where the ability to manipulate others is actually more valuable than the ability to care for them. Because in the book, the baddies aren't monsters. They're just honest students who've learned that success means never letting feelings interfere with the results. They demonstrate something that we're desperately trying not to see, that sophisticated social performance can coexist with complete moral vacancy. They are the endpoint of what my old bosses would call perception management. Now, John Isidore functions as a kind of counterpoint to all of this, or a control sample for what we're losing. Officially, he's special, as I've said, and he's written off by every system that matters, but practically, he's the only character whose first instinct is always to care, whether it's for the cat at the repair shop, for the strangers hiding in his building, for life at such as he encounters it, and always without calculation or without performance. I think the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who I mentioned a few times, would recognise what's happening there. The face of the vulnerable places you under an infinite responsibility before any conscious decision kicks in. You don't choose to be responsible, responsibility chooses you. Isidore embodies this perfectly. When the androids show up at his building, he doesn't calculate whether helping them serves his interests. He simply responds to their vulnerability because that's what caring people do. I think Dick is making a rather radical argument here, that empathy isn't a luxury good that comes with intelligence and education. It survives in people often that our systems have discounted, and it's recognisable without any performance at all. The question is whether we still have room for these people in the world we're almost unintentionally building. And I think the contrast with Blade Runner becomes crucial here. Scott's film finds personhood in the replicants and asks the system to recognise it, but Dick constructs his entire cast to argue that recognition must follow from an inner capacity that you either have or you don't. One that you can't purchase with style, you can't fake with performance, and you can't force with arguments. And crucially, he lets the most unglamorous figures in the book, like Iran or Isidore, carry the book's moral weight. The people our systems overlook turn out to be the ones who understand what actually matters. In a world increasingly dominated by sophisticated performance and strategic emotional intelligence, Dick suggests that authentic empathy might survive most reliably in those who lack the resources or the inclination to fake it. So, how do you stay human when you can't tell authentic connection from algorithmic manipulation? Well, Dick's solution in the book is mercerism, and perhaps you're already practicing it. The ritual itself looks deceptively simple. You grip the handles of an empathy box, you close your eyes, and suddenly you're fusing with Wilbur Mercer as he climbs an endless hill under a rain of stones. You feel other people inside your nervous system, strangers from across the city sharing the same struggle, the same pain. When you come back, you're scraped by stones that never touched your body, carrying wounds from a suffering that wasn't only yours. Replace the empathy box with a smartphone, and I think it might be describing our daily experience. We scroll through feeds filled with other people's pain, outrage, and struggle. We feel genuine emotional responses to events happening to strangers thousands of miles away. We come back from these digital sessions carrying real psychological wounds from suffering we never directly experienced. The technology has changed, but the fundamental dynamic that Dick described is now our basic mode of existence. And here's a bit of an uncomfortable truth too. Your Discord friends might actually be more real to you than your neighbours. Your Twitter outrage might actually feel more meaningful than your actual votes. I'd argue that Dick kind of predicted this exact moment. But then comes that inevitable moment of exposure. In the book, Buster Friendly drops his bombshell live on television, revealing Mercer as a complete fraud with a studio set, looped footage, and a hired actor climbing fake rocks. That revelation lands with the deflation of a balloon we've all been expecting to pop. And then nothing essentially changes. Iran keeps fusing, so do millions of others. Because I think the characters in this book and us, we've watched this exact scenario play out repeatedly in our own worlds. Every few months, some major platform or movement gets exposed as manipulative or artificial or fundamentally fake. We learn that our social media feeds are curated algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than truth, for example. Or we discover that viral movements are often manufactured by bots and bad actors. We find out that influencers we follow are performing authenticity for profit. And yet we keep scrolling. We keep engaging. We keep participating. Dick's point cuts to the core of our current dilemma. Some practices work because of what they do to people together, not because their infrastructure survives fact-checking. The ritual has manufactured a reflex of connection that isolated people just can't afford to lose, and that, if we're honest, actually reflects something good about ourselves. The desire to be together and experience things together. But once that reflex is installed, it survives the exposure because the alternative, complete isolation, feels worse than participating in something you know is partially fake. And I think Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities, which is one amongst many similar ideas, explains why this kind of thing works. Nations, for example, exist because millions of strangers imagine themselves connected to people they'll never meet, reading the same newspapers, participating in the same rituals, sharing the same symbols. Mercerism operates as a pure distillation of this process in the book, and so do our own digital platforms. Through social media, isolated people scattered across the globe imagine themselves into shared experiences of crisis, of celebration, of outrage, of other things. They'll never meet each other, but they're bound together by the knowledge that this moment, and at this moment, others are feeling the same anger or the same hope or the same fear that they are. They feel confirmed by those who agree and confronted by those who don't. I think the difference, though, is that Anderson was describing organic communities that evolved over centuries, while we're experiencing manufactured communities designed by algorithms in corporate boardrooms that have sprung up practically overnight. Now, our imagined communities are being imagined for us, optimized for engagement and revenue rather than genuine connection. But the real human need they address remains real, which is why people keep participating even after learning about the manipulation. And I think this is where the empathy in the book transforms from a test into a discipline. Because the Voigt-Kampff test measures whether you can respond to suffering automatically, but Mercerism trains that response into a daily habit. The way prayer or group mourning can keep compassion alive even when you're exhausted or numb, for example. Our digital platforms are doing something similar. They're training us to have emotional responses to distant events and to feel connected to strangers, to have us care about things that don't directly affect us. The question is whether this training is making us more empathetic or just more emotionally reactive and volatile. Are we actually developing a deeper capacity for genuine care, or are we just becoming more skilled at performing concern? The hoax in the book reveals that engineered empathy can still create real solidarity, but it doesn't tell us whether that solidarity is sustainable or whether it's directing our attention towards things that actually need our care. Compare this to Blade Runner's vision of redemption. Scott's film has no church, no daily fusion, no shared ritual that binds the city together. Salvation just arrives at a singular moment, Roy Batty's last-second rescue of Deckard. It's an eruption of grace that, yes, punctures the world's cruel logic for about 1 minute on a rooftop. But then it goes. Philip K. Dick prefers the slower fix. His broken society keeps itself barely human by rehearsing feeling together, day after day, even when everybody knows that the set is cardboard and the footage is looped. But what makes this both hopeful and terrifying, at least for me, is this. It's maintenance work on the community's capacity to care. And it's also potentially maintenance work on our capacity to be manipulated. So to sum it all up, here's what I think Philip K. Dick understood that we're really now only just catching up to. And it's that the most dangerous moment isn't when machines become indistinguishable from humans, it's when humans become indistinguishable from machines. For me, he wasn't writing dystopian fiction, but perhaps survival instructions for a new age. And we spent this video talking about androids and empathy tests and electric sheep, but Dick wasn't really writing about robots. As I've argued, he's writing about us. About what happens when performance becomes so sophisticated that we forget that there's supposed to be something underneath it. About what happens when we outsource so much of our emotional and social lives to technology that we lose track of what we're supposed to be maintaining. The Voigt-Kampff test isn't science fiction anymore. I think we're already living with algorithmic systems that sort people into categories based on behavioural markers, already debating whether AI responses that sound empathetic count as empathy. We're already struggling to distinguish authentic human connection from increasingly sophisticated simulations. And I think that Dick's real insight was recognizing that conscience isn't a thing that you just have. It's a practice that you maintain. That empathy isn't a capacity that you're born with, it's a discipline you must choose daily. And ultimately, the community isn't something that happens naturally, but really something that you build through repeated acts of attention. Even when those acts feel artificial, even when the object of your care turns out to be fake. And here's another thing that I think Philip K. Dick saw that his critics often miss. He wasn't pessimistic about this future, he was just pragmatic about it. The electric toad at the end of the book, that isn't a tragic ending. I think it's an opportunity. He's trying to tell us that when authenticity becomes impossible to verify, what really matters is the choice to care. That becomes the only authentic act left. And Dick's answer to this conundrum is simple. Keep practicing, keep paying attention, keep choosing to care, especially when caring feels pointless. That practice is what makes you human. That attention is what matters, not what you're attending to. Philip K. Dick saw this coming 60 years ago. And the question is, now that we're here, what are we going to do? But that's it for Philosophical Film Club for now. So until next time, be wise and be kind and don't push any goats off roofs.